Welcome back to our series on Does Capital. Last time we spent an entire episode inside a single commodity, cracking it open to find labor, value, and eventually a strange kind of magic trick called fetishism hiding inside it. Today we ask a much more practical question that Marx himself asks next. How does an exchange actually happen? Not in theory, not as an abstract ratio on a page, but as a real event between two real people standing in a real marketplace.
That sounds like it should be the easiest question in the whole book. Two people want different things, they swap. What is there to explain?
That is exactly the assumption Marx wants to slow down and take apart, because it turns out to be hiding something quite important. For an exchange to happen at all, something has to be true before the swap ever takes place. The two people involved have to already recognize each other as owners, as people with a private, exclusive right to dispose of the thing in their hands. You cannot simply take a thing you want and hand over a thing in return, unless both sides already accept a very particular social fact, that each of you has the right to give this specific object away, and that neither of you has any claim over the other's remaining possessions once the trade is done.
So exchange presupposes a kind of prior agreement about property itself, before a single word about price gets spoken.
Precisely, and Marx makes a lovely, slightly playful observation about this. He says that in the exchange, the two commodity owners must, in effect, recognize each other reciprocally as owners of private property. This juridical relation, whose form is the contract, whether it is enshrined in an actual legal system or not, is a relation between two wills which mirrors the economic relation. In plainer terms, the whole apparatus of contracts, property law, and legal ownership that grew up around markets did not appear out of nowhere or from pure philosophical reasoning about justice. It grew directly out of the practical requirements of exchange itself, becoming absolutely necessary the moment commodity production became widespread. Law follows economic practice here, according to Marx, rather than economic practice following from some abstract legal theory dreamed up first.
Give us a genuinely concrete historical anchor for that claim, because it is a fairly bold one about the relationship between law and economics.
Happy to. Look at Roman law, which remains the foundation for most property and contract law across Europe and much of the world even today. Roman commercial law developed an extraordinarily sophisticated set of categories for exactly this problem, distinguishing different kinds of ownership, different kinds of contracts, sale, loan, deposit, pledge, precisely because Rome was an enormous trading empire stretching from Britain to North Africa to the Near East, with merchants constantly needing reliable, enforceable rules for exchanging goods with total strangers they might never see again. Compare that with earlier tribal or kinship-based societies, where goods often moved between people through obligation, gift-giving, and reciprocal custom, rather than through anything resembling a formal contract between strangers treated as equal, interchangeable legal persons. The shift toward abstract, impersonal contract law tracks remarkably closely with the historical growth of trade between people who are not bound by kinship or personal loyalty at all, only by the transaction itself.
And I imagine medieval merchant law gives us another clear example of this same pattern playing out again, centuries later.
It gives us a wonderful one, actually. Starting around the 11th and 12th centuries, as trade fairs across medieval Europe grew larger and drew merchants from increasingly distant regions, speaking different languages and operating under different local customs, a specialized body of custom emerged called the law merchant, often known by its Latin tag, lex mercatoria. This was not handed down by kings or church councils. It developed organically, fair by fair, dispute by dispute, among merchants themselves, precisely because ordinary local law, built for settled agricultural communities, simply could not handle the volume and complexity of long-distance commercial exchange between strangers. Special merchant courts sprang up at trade fairs like the famous ones in Champagne in northeastern France, staffed by merchants themselves rather than ordinary judges, resolving disputes quickly so that trade could keep flowing. This is Marx's point demonstrated in vivid historical detail. The legal and contractual scaffolding around exchange grows out of the practical needs of exchange itself, rather than descending from some prior abstract theory of justice.
Let us push on something that seems like a genuine puzzle here, though. If exchange requires this prior recognition of private ownership, where does that recognition itself actually come from, historically? It cannot simply be assumed as a starting point without explanation.
This is exactly the kind of question that keeps this material honest rather than tidy, and it connects directly back to the primitive accumulation material we flagged as coming later in the series, in the chapters covering the enclosure movement in full. Because the answer, historically, is often not peaceful mutual agreement at all. It frequently involves violence, conquest, and state-enforced dispossession, converting what had been communal or customary land use into exclusive, tradable private property, sometimes at gunpoint or by act of parliament. The clean, abstract picture of two free and equal owners calmly agreeing to a contract, which classical economists like Adam Smith tend to present as though it were simply natural, obscures a messier and often more violent history of how property itself, particularly land and eventually labor power, actually got carved up into privately ownable pieces in the first place. Marx is careful, even at this early, seemingly dry stage of the argument about contracts, to plant the seed that will bloom much later into his fuller historical critique.
That is a genuinely important complication to sit with, rather than letting the contract stage sound too clean and voluntary.
Agreed, and it is worth being fair to the other side of this too. Defenders of classical and modern market economics would respond that however property rights originated historically, and nobody seriously denies that history is often violent, once a stable, enforceable system of private property and contract exists, it demonstrably enables enormously productive, mutually beneficial exchange between strangers who would otherwise have no way to cooperate at all, and that this productive benefit is a real, separate question from the sometimes ugly history of how property arrangements first got established. Reasonable people disagree sharply about how much weight to put on the originating history versus the ongoing function, and that disagreement runs right through debates about property and inequality, even today.
Is there a useful contrast case? A society that organized exchange without ever developing this kind of formal contract apparatus at all, just to sharpen the picture.
There is a genuinely well-studied one, the Kula ring, a ceremonial exchange system practiced among island communities in the Trobriand Islands off Papua New Guinea, made famous by the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski in the 1920s. Participants exchanged shell necklaces and armbands across a wide circuit of islands, but this exchange was governed entirely by elaborate custom, ritual obligation, and personal relationship, not by anything resembling an enforceable contract between abstract legal owners. You could not simply refuse to eventually pass along an item, but the enforcement mechanism was social reputation and customary expectation, not a court or a written agreement. It illustrates precisely the contrast Marx has in mind. Exchange absolutely can and does happen without formal contract law, but it happens differently, embedded in ongoing personal and communal relationships rather than treating each transaction as a discrete, impersonal event between interchangeable legal persons who may never interact again.
So we have established that exchange requires this prior social recognition of ownership, formalized eventually into contract and law. But contracts and mutual recognition alone still do not solve the practical problem we touched on back in episode 1, the sheer difficulty of finding someone who wants exactly what you have and has exactly what you want.
Exactly right, and that practical difficulty is precisely what forces society toward a universal equivalent, a single commodity everyone will accept, which is where money enters the picture properly. We spent time last episode tracing that historical emergence, from cattle to cowrie shells to gold. What we have not yet done is actually break apart what money does, functionally, once it exists. Money is not just one thing, Marx argues. It performs several genuinely distinct social functions, and confusing them, which people do constantly even today, causes real conceptual confusion about how economies actually work. That functional breakdown is exactly where we are headed in part 2. Welcome back. So money exists, we know how it historically emerged, but what does money actually do? Marx insists on separating out its functions carefully, because collapsing them together, which happens constantly in everyday speech, causes genuine confusion about how prices, currency, and value actually relate to each other.
Start with the first function then, since I imagine there is a natural order to walk through here.
There is, and the first function is money as a measure of value. This is money's role in letting us express the value of any commodity as a price, a certain quantity of the money commodity. And here is the genuinely surprising part. Marx points out that money can perform this function purely ideally, purely in the head, without a single actual coin or note needing to be physically present anywhere in the room.
That sounds almost like a magic trick. How can money measure something without actually being there?
Think about how a shopkeeper prices goods on a shelf. She does not need to physically weigh out gold next to every item to assign it a price tag. She simply imagines, mentally, how much gold, or in modern terms how many currency units, that item is worth, and writes the number down. The commodity gets what Marx calls a price form, an ideal, imagined quantity of money, entirely separate from the moment actual cash changes hands. You can price your house at a certain amount without a single banknote being anywhere near the property. Money as a measure of value is almost like a ruler that exists conceptually, in agreed social convention, before it is ever physically applied to anything.
So there is a difference, then, between money measuring value in this ideal sense, and money serving as an actual, fixed unit like a dollar or a pound.
Exactly, and this is Marx's second related concept, the standard of price. Once you have agreed that gold, say, is the material that measures value, you still need to fix a specific, standardized quantity of that gold as your basic counting unit, an ounce, a certain weight, so that prices can be compared consistently across the whole economy. This is a technical, almost bureaucratic function, distinct from the deeper question of value itself. It is simply about establishing a reliable, fixed unit of measurement, the way we fix a meter as a specific length or a kilogram as a specific weight.
And I would guess the actual names of many historical currencies come directly from this literal weight-based standard.
They do, wonderfully directly in fact. The British pound sterling was originally, quite literally, defined as 1 pound weight of sterling silver, hence the name. This was not a metaphor. Medieval English currency really was tied to an actual physical weight of precious metal held as a standard. Similarly, the Italian lira descends from the Latin libra, meaning a pound weight, and the French livre worked the same way. These were not abstract financial units invented by economists. They were literal units of weight for precious metal that gradually became detached from that original physical meaning as monetary systems evolved.
That physical detachment sounds like it opens the door to some fairly serious mischief on the part of whoever controls the currency.
It opens the door to exactly that, and history gives us a spectacular, well-documented example. King Henry VIII of England in the 1540s, facing enormous debts from expensive wars against France and Scotland, ordered what historians now call the Great Debasement. The Royal Mint was instructed to reduce the actual silver content of English coins while keeping their official face value exactly the same, mixing in cheaper base metals like copper. A coin that officially represented, say, 1 shilling in value increasingly contained far less than 1 shilling's worth of actual silver. This let the crown effectively pay off debts and expenses with coins that looked and were legally valued the same as before, but that everyone eventually realized contained a fraction of the real precious metal they used to. Prices across England rose sharply as a direct result, an early, vivid case of currency debasement driving inflation, centuries before anyone had the modern vocabulary of monetary policy to describe exactly what was happening.
That maps with striking precision onto the hyperinflation examples we covered last episode: Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe. It is the same underlying mechanism, just executed with a coin clipper's shears instead of a printing press.
precisely the same mechanism, dressed in a different technology for a different century. And it is worth noting this is not merely ancient history either. Currency debasement in Marx's broader sense, quietly eroding the real value behind a nominally stable unit, remains a live, actively debated feature of modern monetary policy. Whenever central banks expand the money supply substantially, defenders argue this supports employment and growth during downturns. Critics argue it functions as a slow, less visible form of the very same debasement Henry VIII practiced more crudely with his coin clippers. And this argument runs directly through contemporary debates about quantitative easing and inflation that are very much still unfolding today.
Was England unique in this practice, or did other major currencies suffer the same fate across history?
Far from unique, it was almost a universal temptation for any government facing financial strain with the power to control a mint. The Roman Empire itself provides one of the most dramatic long-term examples. The silver content of the Roman denarius fell steadily across roughly 2 centuries, from close to full silver purity under Emperor Augustus down to a coin that was barely silver-plated bronze by the middle of the 3rd century, under the pressure of funding an enormous, expensive military and an increasingly strained imperial treasury. Historians have long connected this steady debasement to the serious price inflation and economic instability that plagued the later Roman Empire. Though, as with most large historical questions, it operated alongside other causes rather than as the sole explanation on its own. The pattern recurs across wildly different eras and continents, precisely because the underlying incentive, quietly reducing the real value behind a nominally stable coin to stretch limited resources further, is available to essentially any authority that controls currency production, whether that authority is an emperor, a king, or a modern central bank.
Has that detachment between a currency's name and any physical backing gone even further in the modern world, beyond just quietly reducing metal content?
It has gone about as far as it possibly can, actually, which makes the historical debasement examples feel almost quaint by comparison. Today, most major currencies have no metal backing whatsoever, not reduced, not diluted, simply absent entirely, as we touched on with the end of the gold standard in 1971. The pound, the dollar, the euro, none of them refer to any fixed weight of anything physical anymore. They are pure units of account, backed only by government decree and collective social trust, exactly the fiat currency point from last episode. But it is worth seeing clearly here that this is the endpoint of a very long historical arc that started with a literal pound of silver sitting on a scale. The standard of price has been steadily, deliberately unmoored from physical substance for centuries. Henry VIII simply represents one particularly blunt, well-documented early chapter in that much longer story.
So, to summarize this function before we move on, money as a measure of value lets us price things ideally, in our heads, without cash needing to be present. And the standard of price is simply the fixed unit, a pound, a dollar, an ounce, that makes those ideal prices comparable and consistent across an entire economy, a unit whose actual backing has, throughout history, proven remarkably easy for those in power to quietly hollow out, and which has now been detached from any physical backing altogether.
That is exactly right, and it sets up our next function perfectly, because measuring value in the abstract is one thing. Actually using money to move goods physically through a real economy, from producer to buyer to seller to another buyer, is an entirely different function, with its own peculiar logic and its own peculiar dangers. That is money as a medium of circulation, and it is where we are headed next. Welcome back. We have covered money measuring value in the abstract. Now let us watch money actually move, doing physical work in a real marketplace, because this function turns out to hide something genuinely dangerous inside it, something Marx thinks classical economists badly underestimated.
Set up the basic picture for us first, before we get to the danger.
Picture a weaver who has produced a bolt of linen. Under pure barter, she would need to find someone who both wants linen and happens to have exactly what she wants in return, the double coincidence of one's problem we discussed last episode. Money dissolves that problem by splitting the transaction into two separate, independent steps. First, she sells her linen for money, commodity converted into money. Then at some later point, possibly immediately, possibly much later, she uses that money to buy something she actually wants, bread, tools, whatever it may be, money converted back into commodity. Marx writes this out as a simple formula: commodity, money, commodity, or C. M. C commodity converts to money converts to a different commodity.
That seems like an obvious improvement over barter. Where exactly does the hidden danger creep in?
It creeps in precisely because those two steps, selling and buying, are now genuinely independent of each other, separated in time and often in space, whereas in direct barter they were fused into a single, simultaneous act. When you barter linen directly for bread, the moment you receive the bread is the exact same moment you give up the linen. Sale and purchase are one indivisible event. But once money enters the picture, the weaver can sell her linen today and simply choose not to buy anything at all tomorrow, or next month, or ever. Nothing forces her to complete the second half of the formula.
And if enough people across an economy make that same choice at the same time, sell but delay buying,
Then you get exactly the kind of breakdown Marx is trying to warn about. A general glut, goods piling up unsold everywhere because money that was received from selling is simply not flowing back out into new purchases fast enough. Marx calls this the possibility of crisis latent within the very structure of money as a medium of circulation, and he is directly, explicitly arguing against economists of his own era, particularly followers of the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say, who held what became known as Say's law, the idea that supply creates its own demand automatically, that a general glut across an entire economy is essentially impossible because every sale is necessarily matched by an equal purchase somewhere in the system.
Marx is essentially saying that Say and his followers mistake the ideal, frictionless textbook version of exchange for how a real, money-based economy actually behaves under pressure.
Precisely, and this is not merely an abstract theoretical dispute. It maps directly onto real historical events. Consider the Panic of 1837 in the United States, a severe economic crisis where banks suspended payments, credit dried up dramatically, and a wave of business failures followed a period of rampant speculation, particularly in land and cotton. Goods did not stop being useful overnight. Factories did not forget how to produce cotton cloth. The physical capacity for supply and demand to match remained entirely intact. What broke down was precisely the monetary chain. People and banks stopped completing the buying half of transactions, hoarding cash or calling in debts instead, and the whole circulation process seized up, throwing enormous numbers of people out of work almost overnight despite nothing physical having changed about the economy's actual productive capacity.
That really does sound like exactly the mechanism Marx is describing. A break specifically in the monetary link between selling and buying, rather than any change in real physical supply or genuine human need.
Exactly, and you can trace this same underlying logic straight through to the most severe crises of the 20th and 21st centuries. During the Great Depression beginning in 1929, and again during the 2008 financial crisis we discussed last episode, physical factories, farms, and workers did not suddenly become useless or unproductive. What seized up was precisely the monetary and credit chain connecting sellers to buyers across the whole economy. Banks stopped lending, consumers stopped spending, businesses could not sell their existing inventory, and the entire system of circulation locked up. Even though the underlying real economy, in a narrow physical sense, remained fully capable of producing and consuming exactly as it had the week before.
That is genuinely useful groundwork. But let us make sure we have named the actual mechanic clearly before moving on, because I think there is a precise technical term buried in what you just described.
There is, and it is worth naming directly because it recurs throughout the rest of the book. Marx calls this whole process the metamorphosis of the commodity, deliberately borrowing a biological sounding word, as though a commodity were a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly and then into something else again. The commodity sheds its own particular, useful form, cloth, wheat, whatever it is, and takes on the universal form of money, only to shed that form as well and take on a new particular useful form through the eventual purchase. Every single commodity in a functioning money economy is constantly undergoing this two-stage transformation, and Marx's point is that the whole vast, seemingly solid edifice of a national or global economy is, at bottom, made up of an almost unimaginable number of these small, individually fragile metamorphoses happening simultaneously, any significant number of which can stall out at the halfway point, money received but not yet reinvested, without the system as a whole necessarily collapsing immediately, but with real, painful consequences accumulating the longer that stall persists.
Let us be fair to the other side of this debate too, though, since we are trying to hold genuine complexity here rather than a tidy story where Marx simply wins.
Absolutely right to flag that. Mainstream macroeconomics since John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s has actually absorbed a version of exactly this insight, arguing that economies genuinely can, and regularly do, get stuck in states of deficient aggregate demand, precisely the kind of gap between selling and buying Marx is describing here, though Keynes and his many economic descendants generally propose quite different policy remedies than Marx does, favoring government spending and monetary intervention to restart circulation, rather than the deeper structural transformation of the whole system that Marx has in mind. It is a genuinely interesting historical irony that an insight Marx developed from a close, almost philosophical reading of the commodity form ended up being rediscovered, independently, and for different underlying reasons, by mainstream economics roughly 70 years later, and remains one of the more interesting points of quiet overlap between Marxist and mainstream economic thinking, even where the two traditions disagree sharply about almost everything else.
That is a genuinely satisfying place to land this particular thread. So, where does the money that gets received from a sale actually go, in the gap before it gets spent again, assuming it does eventually get spent?
That question takes us directly into our next stretch of material, the practice of hoarding, and its more sophisticated cousin, money functioning as a means of payment through credit and debt, both of which reveal even more about how fragile and how powerful this whole monetary system really is. That is exactly where we are headed in Part 4. Welcome back. We ended Part 3 with money sitting halfway through its metamorphosis, received from a sale, not yet spent on a purchase. What actually happens to money sitting in that gap? Marx identifies two genuinely distinct possibilities, and both turn out to be historically fascinating.
Start with the simpler one, presumably.
The simpler one is hoarding, quite literally holding onto money rather than spending it, pulling it out of circulation and letting it sit still. Marx treats this as a genuine, structurally important behavior, not just individual miserliness, because once money exists as a universal equivalent, it becomes the one thing that can always, in principle, be exchanged for anything else in the entire economy. It represents a kind of pure, unrealized potential, and that makes simply accumulating it, rather than spending it, a rational strategy under real conditions of uncertainty.
Give us a genuinely historical picture of hoarding at scale, beyond the image of an individual miser counting coins alone at night.
Happy too, because it operated at a genuinely staggering scale across history. For centuries, enormous quantities of silver mined in Spanish colonial territories in the Americas, particularly the extraordinary deposits at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, flowed across the Pacific and eventually into Ming and Qing dynasty China, where it was absorbed into private hoards, temple treasuries, and eventually the imperial treasury itself at a scale that genuinely reshaped global trade patterns for well over 2 centuries. Historians estimate that a very substantial share of all the silver mined in the Americas between the 1500s and 1800s eventually ended up hoarded or circulating within China, partly because Chinese tax policy under these dynasties increasingly required payment in silver, and partly because silver held a deeply established cultural and monetary role there stretching back centuries. This was not simple miserliness. It reflected a genuine, structurally important store of value function operating across an entire civilization, shaping global shipping routes, colonial economics, and eventually contributing to serious monetary instability in China itself when international silver supplies fluctuated.
That is a genuinely enormous, world-spanning example of hoarding, far bigger than the popular image of a single miser with a chest of gold coins under the floorboards.
Considerably bigger, yes, and it demonstrates something important. Hoarding is not always a withdrawal from productive economic life. Sometimes it functions as a store of value that entire empires and trading systems structurally depend upon. Central banks today still hold enormous gold reserves for essentially this same underlying reason. A store of trusted value to fall back on when other forms of trust in the monetary system come under strain.
So that is hoarding. What is the second possibility you mentioned? Money functioning as a means of payment.
This is where things get genuinely more sophisticated and honestly more dangerous. Money as a means of payment appears whenever a sale and its corresponding payment becomes separated in time through credit. I deliver goods to you today, and you promise, often in a written, legally binding form, to pay me at some specified point in the future. This single innovation, buying now and paying later, opens up an entirely new economic world, one built on chains of promises, obligations, and debts stretching across an economy, rather than simple, immediate cash transactions.
And chains, by their nature, can break at any single weak link, with consequences rippling well beyond that one broken connection.
That is exactly the danger Marx identifies, and it is worth tracing historically because the mechanism recurs with remarkable consistency. Medieval and early modern trade fairs developed sophisticated instruments called bills of exchange, essentially a written promise that a merchant in one city would pay a merchant in another city a certain sum at a future date, often after several intermediary merchants had each endorsed and passed along that same bill, effectively using it as a kind of proto-currency in its own right, changing hands multiple times before finally being settled at the fair's end. This let enormous volumes of trade occur across long distances without physically shipping gold or silver back and forth every single time, a genuine, celebrated innovation. But it also meant that if any single merchant somewhere along that chain of endorsements failed, went bankrupt, or simply could not pay when the bill came due, the failure could cascade backward through every single merchant who had endorsed that same bill along the way, each of whom was now personally liable for the unpaid debt.
That sounds like an almost exact historical preview of what modern financial commentators call contagion risk in today's banking system.
It is essentially the exact same underlying mechanism, dressed in medieval merchant clothing rather than modern financial engineering. And this connects directly and vividly to the 2008 crisis we discussed last episode, where complex chains of mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps meant that a wave of defaults on individual home mortgages in the United States cascaded through an enormous, densely interconnected global chain of financial obligations, ultimately threatening the stability of banks on entirely different continents that had never made a single mortgage loan to any of the original defaulting homeowners themselves. Marx's basic insight from the 1860s, that money as a means of payment creates chains of obligation whose failure at any single point can ripple outward with startling force, describes something that remains, almost eerily, a live and central feature of how modern global finance actually operates and occasionally breaks down.
It is worth being fair here too, presumably, since credit clearly also enables an enormous amount of genuinely productive economic activity that could never happen through pure cash transactions alone.
Completely fair and important to say plainly. Credit and means of payment relationships are not simply a source of fragility, they are also precisely what allows large-scale, long-distance, long-term economic projects, building a railway, financing a harvest across an entire growing season, funding a manufacturing enterprise, to happen at all. Marx is not arguing credit is bad. He is arguing that this genuinely productive innovation carries within it a specific, structural fragility that classical economists of his era tended to wave away far too quickly, treating money as though it were simply a neutral, frictionless veil over an underlying barter economy, rather than an active force capable of generating crises entirely on its own terms.
Does this same chain of payment logic show up in genuinely everyday, non-financial crisis terms too? Something people encounter more routinely than a global banking collapse.
It shows up constantly, actually, in something as ordinary as supply chain payment terms between businesses. A small furniture manufacturer might deliver a large order to a retail chain today, but the contract specifies payment only after 60 or 90 days, a completely standard arrangement in many industries. The manufacturer, in turn, often owes payments to its own timber suppliers on a much shorter schedule. If the retail chain delays payment further, or worse, goes bankrupt before paying at all, the manufacturer can find itself unable to pay its own suppliers, who in turn may struggle to pay their own workers or creditors. This is precisely Marx's chain of means of payment relationships operating in miniature, every single day, across ordinary commercial life, entirely without any dramatic global crisis required to make the fragility visible. It is simply built into how credit-based commerce functions at every scale, from a small regional furniture business up to the largest multinational banks.
So we have now covered measure of value, medium of circulation, hoarding, and means of payment. Is there a final function left to complete the picture?
There is one more, and it takes us beyond any single national economy entirely into the relationships between nations. That is world money, and it closes out our tour of Chapter 3 perfectly, setting up the transition into the whole next stage of the book, where money stops simply circulating and starts trying to grow. Welcome back for our final part on Chapters 2 and 3. We have one more function of money to cover, and then we pull the whole episode together.
World money sounds like it should be the grandest of all the functions, given the name alone.
It genuinely is the broadest in scope. Marx observes that once you step outside the boundaries of a single nation, all the local conventions, national coinage, paper currency backed by a specific government, standardized weights and measures lose their authority. Between nations, money has to shed its local, national clothing and reappear in its most basic, universally recognized form. Historically, this meant actual bars or coins of precious metal, weighed out and assessed on the world market essentially as a commodity again, valued for its actual metal content rather than for any national stamp or promise printed on it.
So on the international stage, money briefly strips back down to what it originally was underneath all the national packaging, a plain commodity.
Exactly that, and this had enormous, very concrete historical consequences. Under the classical gold standard, which most major trading economies operated under from roughly the 1870s through the 1930s, international trade imbalances were actually settled through the physical shipment of gold bullion between national treasuries and central banks. If one country consistently imported more than it exported, gold would literally flow out of that country's reserves and into its trading partners' vaults over time, and central banks watched these gold flows closely as a genuine, physical indicator of a nation's trading position, adjusting interest rates and domestic policy in direct response to gold literally leaving or entering the country.
That sounds like an almost unbearably slow, physically cumbersome way to manage an entire international economy, by comparison with how things work today.
It was genuinely cumbersome, and it built in real, sometimes brutal constraints. A country experiencing a bad harvest or a war might see gold drain rapidly out of its reserves, forcing painful domestic contraction, higher interest rates, reduced lending, precisely at the moment its own population could least afford it. This rigidity is a large part of why most of the world eventually abandoned the gold standard, first partially during the World Wars and the Great Depression, and then completely and finally when the United States severed the dollar's direct convertibility to gold in 1971, the same Nixon shock we discussed last episode. World money today largely takes the form of a small handful of trusted national fiat currencies, the dollar especially, functioning as reserve currencies that other nations hold and use to settle international trade and debts, a role built entirely on collective trust and geopolitical power rather than on any physical commodity changing hands between vaults.
And I would guess ongoing debates about the dollar's dominance as the world's reserve currency, and whether that dominance might shift toward other currencies over time, connect directly back to exactly this concept.
They connect directly, and it remains a genuinely live, unresolved question in international economics and geopolitics right now, with real, serious debate among economists and policymakers about whether currencies like the Chinese yuan, or potentially some form of digital or multilateral currency arrangement, might eventually challenge the dollar's role as the primary form of world money, precisely the function Marx is describing here, just playing out through entirely different technological and institutional means, the 19th century gold bars, physically crossing oceans on ships.
Is there a concrete recent example of this world money function actually being tested or challenged, rather than just an abstract possibility economists discuss?
There is a genuinely current one worth naming plainly. Following the extensive financial sanctions imposed on Russia after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, including the freezing of a substantial portion of the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves held in Western institutions, a number of countries began actively exploring alternatives to conducting trade in dollars specifically to reduce their exposure to exactly this kind of freeze. Various bilateral arrangements to settle trade in national currencies directly, bypassing the dollar entirely, expanded noticeably in the years that followed. Whether this represents the beginning of a genuine structural shift away from dollar dominance as world money, or simply a modest, largely symbolic adjustment at the margins, remains a genuinely open and actively debated question among economists and foreign policy analysts. But it shows the abstract function Marx describes here is very much alive as a live geopolitical stake in the present moment, not merely a historical curiosity from the age of gold bars on ships.
Let us pull the whole episode together now, then, because we have covered a lot of genuinely distinct territory across these two chapters.
Let us do that. We started with the process of exchange itself, and found that trading requires commodity owners to already recognize each other as private property holders, a social and eventually legal relationship, contract and property law, that grows directly out of the practical demands of trade rather than descending from abstract philosophy, while also acknowledging the sometimes violent, dispossessive history behind how that private ownership actually got established in the first place. We then broke money down into its distinct functions. Money as a measure of value, letting us price things ideally without cash needing to be physically present. Money as a standard of price, the fixed unit like a pound or dollar that made those prices comparable, a standard whose actual physical backing has proven remarkably easy to quietly hollow out throughout history, from Henry VIII's debased coins to today's fully unbacked fiat currencies. Money as a medium of circulation, splitting exchange into two independent steps, selling and buying, a split that creates the genuine possibility of economic crisis when that chain breaks down, as it repeatedly has throughout economic history. Money as a store of value through hoarding, operating at civilizational scale across centuries of global silver flows. Money as a means of payment, creating chains of credit and debt, whose fragility at any single link can cascade outward with startling force. And finally, money as world money, stripped of national clothing and reappearing on the international stage as a plain commodity, or, in the modern world, as a trusted reserve currency underpinned by collective confidence rather than physical metal.
That is a genuinely comprehensive map of everything money quietly does, mostly invisibly, every single day.
And notice where all of this has been leading quietly the whole time. We now have a fully developed picture of commodities and a fully developed picture of money. But money, so far, has only been doing one thing: mediating exchange, helping commodities move from one owner to another. Marx's next move, and it is one of the great turns in the entire book, is to ask what happens when money stops simply circulating and instead becomes the starting point of an entirely different kind of process, one where money is used specifically to make more money. That transformation, money into capital, is where the whole character of the book shifts, from describing how a market economy functions in general to explaining the very particular, very peculiar logic of capitalism specifically.
A shift from markets in general to capitalism in particular. That sounds like exactly the right place to end this episode.
It is precisely that turning point, and we will pick it up directly in our next episode, covering the general formula for capital and the strange puzzle hiding inside it. If commodities really do exchange at their true values, where does profit actually come from it all? Thank you for staying with us through chapters 2 and 3. We will see you next time.